Thank you all for having me. Thank you for CUNY-IIE for inviting me. So I am an academic in many ways now. So this will, I plan to try to make this interactive, and hopefully we will, and I think we'll engage in lots of conversations together. But I too much rely on PowerPoint. Like, that is my style now, very much a professor. So I have lots of slides, but we'll see what we will go through. And I've already adapted, moved some things around based on the conversations we were just having. So I'm excited to get into this. I've titled the keynote, or our talk, Learning with and From Immigrant Families, an interactive session on cultural congruence and justice-centered engagement. And I have my notes in front of me, but I have to use this clicker as well. So this is a little bit of what I'm hoping to do in the hour and 25 minutes that we have together. I'm also not as good as 12 or K-12 educators in that my time management really is bad. So we will see if we get through it all. But this is what I hope to talk about. By the end, I hope that you're able to talk about cultural congruence and how that shapes family engagement with learning in schools, identify the role of community and state-level policy in the community resources in state-level policy and the well-being of immigrant families, and considering how partnering with immigrant-origin students and research can be used for change. Before we start, I just want to begin by recognizing that the lands currently occupied by the University of Connecticut, which I am a part of, is the territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, and Schaghticoke, and Golden Hill Pawtucket, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples. And additionally here, today we're at the City College of New York, which is grounded on the schist bedrock outcrop of Harlem, and it is situated on the ancestral homeland territory of the Munsee, Lenape, Wappinger, and Wecquaesgeek peoples. These lands were the traditional territory of these native peoples prior to their forced removal, and they continue to carry the stories of these nations, oops, see, I'm not advancing my slides, and their struggles for survival and identity. As institutions of learning, I think we have particular responsibilities to recognize the history of dispossession that allows for the growth of both of these institutions, and we're obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that these universities have played in shaping them. This acknowledgement is just a start, and centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward. So I'm going to start with asking you to look at these pictures. Sorry, the fonts, because I'm on a different computer, have moved around a little bit. But there's 3 pictures here, and these were taken by Latine immigrant origin students as part of a larger project that I'll talk about later, in response to asking them how their educational institution supports their success. And so I think there's 1 or 2 math educators in here, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about myself later, but I'm going to use, maybe successfully, a notice and wonder protocol. My husband is a math coach for district, and we talk a lot about teaching, and he coaches me on our date nights when we're away from our 3-year-old, and I don't pay him for it. So, but that's what I'm going to ask us to do. So I'm going to ask you just first to think to yourself a little bit, and what do you notice about either of these or any of these pictures? So I'll give you 30 seconds to a minute, and then I'll guide you further. So this comes out of a project that I'll talk about near the end of the talk that was with college students. So it's with higher ed. And it was part of a 4-month project using photo voice, which I'll talk about later, which is a process of using photography for research. And they selected, this is part of a group of 6 photos to describe, in general, the larger conversation was, how does your institution, which was a Hispanic serving institution, which is a designation the federal government gives to some universities who have more than 25% Latina student body. Won't get into that right now. But how does that institution support you? And they, after about 15 or 16 sessions, 3 hours a week taking photos, they would take photos, talk about them, analyze them together, come up with new prompts. This was one of the patterns of things that they saw across everything that they were saying. And this theme was called Imposter Phenomenon. And they wrote, as the answer to their theme, our theme, Imposter Phenomenon, shows a story through 6 pictures. You see 6 here today. We have compiled it here into 3. First, we can see the grocery store on the left, seamlessly incorporating food and culture without disturbing flow or making a single item out of place. They see me here without having to knock. Please reach out, interconnectedness. Feeling included outside of campus places, stores having products that are Latine in ways that are blended, fitting in without being labeled as separate. The way this grocery store makes us feel like home is what we're searching for when we attend campus. The next image we see is the painting of the bus saying, written, "No reason to stay. We don't feel qualified to be in this academic space, but I'm here learning their ways. I often think about how this is a stop where I need to get off, but I have to keep going." And finally, we can see the generations before us who support us and help create these opportunities for us. Even though we feel it's hard and we feel so isolated at times, we persist for them, for everyone that came before them, and for everyone that comes after, at your own pace in this big space.
Is this the same student?
No, different students.
So like they're different pictures from each from a different student.
Yeah, so, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in the end. Over those 15 weeks, we had about 8 sessions where they're taking pictures. So by the end, we had like 135 different pictures. And we looked over our conversations. We met for 3 hours once a week. And then they said, what are the patterns of things? Okay. And then they pulled the photos that they said, this is imposter phenomenon was what they called this pattern, our theme. And they pulled these photos together to tell that story. And one thing that I want to add to answer some of your wonderings as we go through, this is actually an Asian grocery store. So this is in Sacramento, California. So it's so interesting to me that you're like, it feels familiar in how some of these things might resonate in different places. This is an Asian grocery store in an area of Sacramento that the neighborhood is a mix of Asian and now Latine immigrants. And they really noticed how products from different Latin American cultures were kind of integrated in kind of just throughout. It wasn't like, you know, another grocery store where you might have like the international foods aisle, the Latin food aisle. And something to think about, even as we were talking earlier about policies, about schools, is something that they felt was really important is just interconnectedness. I think often in school spaces, probably more in university than K-12, you know, we say, okay, this is the area for immigrant issues. This is the Center for Latine students. This is the Center for Women's Resources. But they wanted to see these things as kind of blended throughout. So thinking about, you know, there's a place and a purpose to the specific work that we do with our immigrant origin students, but how are those other resources and things blended throughout the specific school spaces that you're in is something to think about. And we'll start talking later about some of the cultural pieces, but really, for many immigrant groups, but most of what I study is Latine immigrant groups, this feeling of connectedness to family and education as a family project and thinking about that throughout is something that's represented here in that last picture. So we'll continue playing with some of these themes throughout as I go through my talk. I first want to just share a little bit about me. And the reason why I share this is so that you know, so you can evaluate some of the things I'm sharing with you. I think, you know, knowledge is constructed together. And some of the best ways to evaluate is you knowing a little bit about who's producing that knowledge, who's sharing it with you. And that allows you to understand my standpoint and say, hey, am I persuaded? Do I think that this is reasonable? Do I think this is knowledgeable? And so I'm a son of immigrants. My family is Portuguese and Colombian. I grew up in New Jersey, and I now live in Connecticut. I'm multilingual. My first language was Portuguese. It's the worst of all the languages I speak now. I speak English and Spanish as well. And I'm a queer cisgender man. And my husband, I mentioned to some of you, was a middle school math teacher for 10 years and now is a math coach for a district in Connecticut. And my son is 3. And then just by way of my journey, so Kel will recognize maybe the first image on the left. But I've worked in community-based organizations. I've worked around school settings, and then with some human rights and research organizations. So really kind of starting with El Centro del Inmigrante in Staten Island, doing kind of grassroots advocacy and that brought me to city and state level advocacy for immigrant groups, working with the New York Immigration Coalition. This is not their logo anymore. It's the old logo, so that's how long ago I was working with them. The Massachusetts Immigrant Refugee Advocacy Coalition, and then working with some human rights organizations like the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, and more recently working with the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families, which has been defunded by the federal government. I was at Sacramento State, and now I'm at the University of Connecticut. But I've kind of moved around in these different spaces, and often thinking about the wraparound services with schools, partnering with schools. And like when Kelly mentioned my official bio, a lot of the ways I think about my research is thinking about social and educational contexts that promote positive development and liberation for Latine immigrant families. So that's just a little bit about my background. My PhD is in applied educational and developmental psychology, so I think a lot about families and how kids grow. As I talk, I mean, I think you all know this, the principles are so strong here. but there's no singular experience of being an immigrant. Ooh, this might be the older slides.
Sorry.
It's okay. I'll fast forward and then come back. There's no singular experience of being an immigrant. So there's great diversity within and among immigrant groups. And although what I'm going to speak to a lot is of the Latine immigrant community, because that's where my research is based, I think that there's a lot that might transfer to other immigrant communities, but it is not the only, and we should be thinking about the diversity among and within groups. And there's also great diversity within the Latine immigrant community, and I'll speak a little bit to that. I also, something that we were all just talking about is the policy landscape is always changing. So the federal, state, and local policies vary and shape experiences, as I'll talk about, and just to know that that's changing a lot. So because of the exercise we just did, I actually wanted to fast forward past this. So I'm going to escape and fast forward so we're not going through a bunch of slides, because I thought it actually may make more sense to start here. So I want to talk about the role of policy and community resources as you all think about yourselves as middle school educators and middle school team members. So I'm going to talk about a research that I worked with a larger team that looked at the role of social policies. And what I mean by that is access to things like WIC, food stamps, Medicaid, TANF, social safety net programs in the US, and other community characteristics and how that promotes immigrant families. We partnered with 2 immigrant organizations, one in California, one in New Hampshire. I'll talk a little bit more about why in a minute. And we had an advisory board of policymakers, advocates, immigrant parents, and experts. And it was funded by these 2 foundations. So the way that we did this is just a detour. I won't go into this too much, but we did 2 things. We had a big national data set of families from around the US. It's a little bit older. It's called the ECLSB, the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study Birth Cohort, and we had about 1,500 families with one parent who was an immigrant. And that allows us to think about what's going on with immigrant families around the country. And they follow children from birth through kindergarten. And then we did focus groups with immigrant parents in those 2 states. We revised some of our analyses, and then we went back to some of those same families and said, this is what we learned. Does that resonate with what you told us? How do you think about that? And we put that all together. We looked at, and my little icons have disappeared. This is what's so sad about using PowerPoint when others use Google, but it's totally okay. So we looked at state policy about these access. I won't talk too much about this today, and community characteristics. But one of the things I want you all to know, and it continues under this federal administration, although it's changing rapidly, is that since '96 in welfare reform, states have a lot of control about which immigrants can get access or not have access to certain social programs. And there's a lot of complexity to the different groups or categories of immigrants, right? There's those who are undocumented. We might have those who are under U visas because they've experienced interpersonal violence and now they've gotten a visa. We might have folks with green card holders. We might have refugees. All of the complexity, which I won't get into today, there are different rules based on the federal level, which usually bars even people with a green card for the first 5 years from any of these programs, to those with U visas, to whether if you are undocumented or unauthorized to be in the country, access to these programs. And states can decide to fill in. So they can open up and say, we're going to create similar replacement programs so that food stamps can be open to anyone. Or it can follow, the other fun complexity with this is it can follow the child. So a parent could have a green card or can be undocumented, but the child was born here. So the food stamps are actually tied to the child. And so the family could be eligible for food stamps through the child, who is a US born citizen, and so can have access to these resources. It makes it very complex. And as we've talked about, these things can feel so complex even to us. And so how is that looking to a family? But as different states can create different policies, it allows, from a research perspective, a very interesting thing where we could start comparing states. We could say, what are those states that have opened it up? And what are those states that have closed off and restricted things further for immigrants? And what can that tell us about what the role of state policy is in supporting the well-being of immigrant families? And again, most of these immigrant families are those with the young children, with 0 to 5. And so I don't have my little map of states. That was one of the slides I added. So before I do that, I will just say we looked at a bunch of different programs and we categorized states as to those who are restrictive or not. If you go back to why New Hampshire and California, Kevin, part of it was I have good connections with immigrant-led organizations in both states, but California, as you might imagine, represents one of those states with a very open, less restrictive policies. And New Hampshire is the singular state in the New England area that is a very restrictive state. I continue to do a lot of work in New Hampshire. It's a very interesting, I think it's a very interesting context here in the Northeast. So some of what we found. What you'll see is on the left is from the quantitative, from that larger survey, and then we have a quote that talks a little bit about what we learned from the qualitative. And we have nice like 3-page briefs as well as some academic papers that you can have access, and I can give you all of the, I can send all of those as well. But what we see is that the state of role policy context matters. So for parents, we see states that are more restrictive, parents are experiencing more parenting stress. And this, what we mean by this is they talk about the ways that they think about their parenting, the ways that they experience kind of anxiety and concerns about what they do with their children and their family is higher in more restrictive states. And this, what you're seeing is at age 2, or is at age 4, but we also found that when the children were age 2. And so when they were in states like New York that are less restrictive, they're feeling less of that parenting stress, and this was significant. Immigrant parents told us they're aware of state policies, and you all kind of alluded to this, right, in our conversations. They know a little bit about what's going on, and so they talked about how this stress influences their well-being. So one of them shared with us, it is also that if you're not doing well yourself, very stressed, you don't have what you need that day to buy food, and you stress and you're in a bad mood, if you receive that support, it's like economic relief. These programs, I repeat, not only are about here's the resource, but look, here's what you can do with what you receive. As educators, you might also be thinking a lot about your students. So again, we're looking at very early academic achievement, and state policy context also was related to some academic achievement. So we see the same thing, quantitative on the left, a quote, and you have a QR code to one of the papers. But children in low-income immigrant families with restrictive states had lower reading skills at age 4 and kindergarten entry. So again, this is, again, the New Hampshire, Florida, Texas examples, least restrictive, New York, maybe Connecticut, California, Washington, examples that they were shown with higher reading skills as a significant difference. And the families helped us understand a little bit about why. And with food stamps, you grab all your kids, you grab your list, and let's go. You only search if you're looking for lower prices, but you don't have to look to cut anything off the list, and sometimes you can even have the luxury of, oh, grab some cookies, grab a juice, so grocery shopping becomes family time. And I think this is the big piece of family time because parents then can interact with their kids in the grocery store and start talking about what they're seeing, what's going on, engaging with them, where what we really heard is that if there is very stressed financially, the penny pinching might mean that they're leaving children at home, or they're comparing prices, constantly trying to make sure they had enough to get what they need for their family and at the checkout. And so the state policy context, and here we're not talking about some of those policies we were just talking about earlier, right? We're not talking about ICE in schools. We're talking about some of the other resource net that is available to families that influences and has a direct effect on some of parent well-being, the stress that they feel, and their children's achievement. Go for it.
I'm thinking about like this idea of everything that you're talking about, and first I looked at my phone and I said, oh my god, the luxury of grab some cookies, grab a juice.
Yeah.
As a person with an almost 2-year-old, like holy moly, that they're necessary items. But anyway, I'm thinking about this experience of going to the grocery store when you're like, uh-oh, let me leave my kids at home because I'm not sure what I can get and I'm not sure what I can do, versus like, hey, we're gonna get 3 apples. Let's do it. That's an early math activity.
Yeah.
Or like, oh look, do you like the Cheerios or the Fruit Loops? That's an early literacy activity, and all those things are built into kids' experiences at such an early age, which makes perfect sense why their reading skills would be affected by it.
Yeah. Also, others feel free to do that same thing, like raise your hand and ask questions. I have some moments for interaction, but totally down for more of that. So the other things that we found out about, sorry, this is gonna mess me up with the clicker. We asked about specific programs. I won't talk too much about here, but exactly what we were talking about. When families receive these programs, so beyond the state level restriction, just receiving these programs allowed them to do more activities with their children, allowed them to be more present, facilitated them to invest in time with their family, and connecting to other knowledge and support. Our quantitative showed that most strongly with SNAP, and there was broad access to these programs. This is pre the changes that have happened now, right? SNAP and Medicaid have undergone massive policy changes that have increasingly excluded, and because of things like sharing of information between Medicaid offices and ICE that has begun to happen, there's a lot more reticence and people have begun disenrolling from the programs. But I do think understanding the connection to these resources is important for us. So we see it with SNAP. Oh, this is gonna keep messing me up. Supportive parenting behaviors over time, that when parents had access to SNAP, they are shown to have more of that supportive parenting. So, and this makes, I mean, Kel was saying that to us, I think this makes intuitive sense. When we are not burdened with having to think about where our food is coming from, we're not stressed by economic resources, we can spend more time with our children and our families and do more things with our kids. And so here again, you have the quote, I mean, with the benefit of food stamps, you don't have the stress of having to use the money you earn to buy food. So whether you like it or not, it takes that stress off your mind and you can be happier. Because of the food stamps and fresh food, I can go to different places. So they're talking about some of the other things that come with these programs. I can go to the Children's Museum. It just pay $9.50 per family for our family, where it would be around $40 otherwise. This card helped me teach my children just by visiting different places and learning. So different states also have different programs, or different localities might give access to folks with things. But accessing these are really stressful for families. Families think a lot about, well, am I going to be able to re-enroll? Am I going to become ineligible? If I start making too much money, depending on the state that you're in, there's something called the financial cliff. You just go over $1 over and you'll be disenrolled. They felt that the income realities weren't always representative of their realities as families. And then as you all started talking about with language and other issues, these processes are burdensome. And often you all as teachers or the social workers or counselors in your schools might be the ones helping families navigate access to these programs. Do you have the right paperwork? How can I help you access the paperwork? How do I think about the language? And families talked about in both states, but more in the restrictive states, more experiences of perceived discrimination or lack of empathy from staff. But we also hear from families that this is social norms, right? Some families felt like I am not in enough need, and so I'm not going to access the programs, even though all the families that we spoke to were eligible for these programs. So they felt like I'm not in enough, or there are people who have it worse off and deserve these programs, which would start to shield them from accessing. So we heard things like, okay, WIC, which is a program for pregnant women and their young children up to 5 around nutrition and some educational support. Maybe I'll take that, or maybe food stamps, but Medicaid, no. Or I need Medicaid and I'm not going to do food stamps. There was also stigma and a lot of myths and misinformation, which is probably what you hear from your students and families all the time. Questions of, my children will have to pay this back in the future, or this will affect my immigration status, something that wasn't true at the time of this study, but now is, and contradictory advice. And this is this is very difficult and complex for families to navigate. I'm going to say one more thing before I turn over to some kind of conversation on the community piece. Building community and trusted networks supported families. So parents described connection and trust with others enhanced their well-being and promoted their feelings of my community is safe. And this was repeated in the quantitative analysis, that just being able to socialize with neighbors, those who reported higher socializing with neighbors had lower parenting stress. So parents saying this here, right? It helps you socially to get out and talk with other parents. If they have other ideas of how to raise your children, things that you might not know, then you share your ideas, you learn, it makes you feel more supported, because sometimes, you feel overwhelmed as being a parent. You think, oh, I'm doing it wrong. And you find another parent who says, no, you're not doing it wrong. I went through that and I'm giving you this advice. So I feel it's important. I was in the group with the folks from Niagara Falls, and some of you were talking, a lot of your families are very engaged in school events, and that's a lot of what I think about. That community and those trusted networks is probably providing some of this relief in the larger context of what's going on. And we asked families, what are the resources? We just had some list. Religious came up a lot, church spaces, Catholic charities, nutrition, both food banks, schools, and the food programs that you provide, SNAP, community clinics, Medicaid, child care and family aid, and some other resources. And they talked about how these places connected them to everyday resources, but also helped them learn how to be a parent in the US. Something that we'll talk about later is that we all, for those of us who have grown up in systems here in the US, we understand what schools might look like, what paperwork might look like. Something that one of the families shared was, in a lot of forms we have DOB, date of birth. Well, if you don't know that acronym, even if you speak English, having that acronym on a form might not make sense to you, but we start to learn these things the more that we become socialized to do this. So a lot of these organizations empower them with what we would call navigational capital. How do I go about this? You all are doing this in real time for your students often, maybe without realizing it. And we also see this in the quantitative. Use of religious and community services was associated with more supportive parenting. So, state policy matters. Families feel what's going on in the state policy, and we see those effects. Social program receipt is associated with being more supportive, having supportive parenting behaviors. Access and utilization is complex. Building community and trusted networks to support parents supports their well-being, and community resources provide access to necessities, empower families in raising children, and navigate new systems. So I went out of order because we just talked about state policy, so I wanted to start here. But I wonder if we want to take a moment to yourself. You don't have to use the worksheets, but it's questions 3 and 4 on the worksheet. There was a nice 3 and 4 in my version here. But what are things that you think you want to learn more about or that you know about relevant to state policy? And what do you want to learn more about? Maybe reflect to yourself, talk to some people, and we can have a little bit of a conversation. And then I'll go into the next piece as well. The experts of that is that you all become such trusted resources for families. So knowing it is a lot to ask for me to say, you need to be up to date on every policy. I mean, this is what Kellen Maite said earlier, right? You're not gonna be able to do that. But knowing where you can point families as a trusted resource to kind of be that bridge. Or then this last piece of building the community, building spaces where parents can be with other parents, I think also is another natural place to be, where they can provide that support to each other, because then they might share resources among each other. And you all are providing that. Yeah, so I think this is the big thing is, it's about, there are people who know, and you all have already talked about the resources you know, and how do you share that with each other and make it a priority, not to be necessarily knowledgeable of every piece of the mental health handbook or to all of these pieces, but then you know who to ask, who to go to, your other colleagues do, because you all are a trusted resource, and I think that makes a really big difference.
What do you think about this grant has sort of allowed us to
talk to us about, which is cultural congruence. So this is pivoting a little bit, but on similar themes. So I'm going to talk about something that what we as developmentalists call is ethnotheories, which are parents' cultural beliefs about children, families, and parenting. And ethnotheories shape our ways of interacting with our children, with each other, with how we do parenting and child rearing. And I think one of the easier examples to think about is sleep, especially sleep with infants. A lot of us might have lots of ideas or strong feelings about what should we do with young children with sleep. Are we very routine focused? Our children have to go to bed at a certain time, wake up at a certain time, making sure they're getting certain hours of nap. There are now lots of apps to support you counting how many hours of sleep your little baby gets. Are you someone that prioritizes what your family does around your child's sleep? Or are you the family that I'm gonna go to the wedding and my child's gonna fall asleep on the seat at the wedding while the family dances? How are your family's activities structured around sleep? This, and I'm hearing chuckles, I'm seeing nods. This is a very easy, salient way to start thinking about how does cultural ideas about children, about the importance of sleep, about whether families should accommodate that, those things bleed into everything else. So even as an adult, so I grew up, I told you, in a Portuguese and Colombian family, where being bien educado, or being very respectful and well educated, is a cultural priority. And usually that means after a party, you're giving everyone a kiss on the cheek and saying bye. You have to say bye to everybody. And also that kind of goes into the night routine. I usually say goodnight to my siblings or my parents before I kind of retreat. I might not be going to sleep, but before I retreat to start my own nighttime thing. My husband's family is WASP on one side, and then culturally Jewish or secularly Jewish on another. Grew up in, we don't have the Long Island team, but Long Island. And one of the first times I was with his family, all of a sudden, people just disappeared for the night. And I was just like, like, what's going on here? I didn't say good night. What do I have to do? Like, no kiss on the cheek? I don't know. And so even as adults, right, these things shape how we are as families. And so I want us to think about how culture shapes our routines and start to think about how do our beliefs, and there was a nice little family picture and a little school picture. No, it's okay. Align in beliefs. How do schools and families align or not align in beliefs about development and goals for children? And how might this alignment matter? And so what happens if there's discontinuity? How does this help us think about whether we perceive families as engaged or disengaged? And so again, I know I'm going to go into a different context. A lot of my research is not with middle schools, but I want to talk about early childhood. So early childhood context where I do a lot of my research as well. And I'm going to just do it by way of talking about early childhood education, so preschool daycare programs in New York. You've heard this all in the news all the time because of the new universal program happening in New York City. But high quality early childhood education is important for young children, and we see that it helps support them for later schooling. And especially for immigrant families, we see higher gains in things like math and language ability when they're enrolled in high quality. But we see, as you can see here, Hispanic immigrant households are using less high quality early childhood education. And there's been some, why is this? There's been some conversations of, the realities of families don't match their work schedules don't match the realities of the preschools or the daycares. They're very expensive. We all know this regardless. Or is this cultural? Is this about the beliefs that families have about who should take care of my children, what's important for my children, and are their goals just not moving them in that way? And so why should we care? I mean, I think a little bit you all are educators, so I'm speaking to the choir, but again, high quality early childhood education is associated with positive academic and behavioral outcomes. And so I think I said this earlier, but it's a critical support also to working families. So let me do a detour in just how I did it. This is the academic in me. I was interested in how families are making decisions about their young children. And this is our larger conversation into culture and how it can shape education. So what I first did was here in the New York area, went to 4 different communities that varied in access to education. And we did group interviews with immigrant families, Latine immigrant families in 2018. Spoke to 22 parents from 18 different families, most of them Spanish speaking. There were some indigenous Maya Quiche speakers as well that were included, and I analyzed it using grounded theory. I'm happy to talk about methods, but don't need to. And then another big national study. You can see kind of a theme of what I do a lot in my research. There was a big national study of early care and education where they interviewed a lot of parents about their children, about their access to preschool. They also interviewed preschool centers across the country, so we were able to match what is available in their community and what we know about the availability of pre-care with those families in that same community, so we can look at some of those things. And I was interested in how do families, again, make decisions. I'm not going to go into all of this research because it's not too appropriate for us here today, but there is a larger model that I want to talk about, and I'll talk about some pieces of how do Latina immigrant families make decisions about who's caring for their youngest children. And I want to talk to you about 3 or 4 of these themes or components. And so we can begin thinking about how does culture shape how families approach education, and which will foreshadow some other things that we're going to talk about. So one of the first things, one of the first pieces here is their ethno-theories, their beliefs about development and parent goals. So something that came up was a mother's care is best. And here's a quote. No, the ideal is that one cares for their own children, because if you give your children to someone else to take care of them, they won't take care of them like one does. The ideal is to take care of your children. This would actually go on to one parent then said, well, then it's my mother who's the next best person. Like it was kind of this chain. This idea that children are recording, especially for indigenous families, there's a lot of research with indigenous communities in Latin America about how even their ways of setting up. So here in the US, I'm about to go on a tangent. See, I'm such a bad academic. This is me in class. I apologize. A lot of what we talk about and a lot in the reading literature is about direct instruction. I am so going on a tangent. I am so sorry. You're going to come in with me. So direct instruction, right? Like, we need to read together with our children. We need to be looking at what we're doing and directing our attention with our youngest. And there's actually a lot of evidence that indigenous cultures in Latin America do a lot of modeling and apprenticeship where that idea of direct attention isn't what is promoted within the household, but children are constantly observing their environment and parents are modeling and in subtle ways scaffolding what children can learn to do. So even language, and there's evidence that even in multilingual households where children are not being spoken to in the indigenous language, they are learning their indigenous language because of this apprenticeship, modeling, learning to participate through observing and pitching in is what it's called, or is kind of talked about by Barbara Rogoff. They're constantly recording their environment and learning. And I think, this came up a lot more with those indigenous families, but this idea that children are always kind of observing and learning from us. Education once appropriate, and maintaining language. So these were some of their beliefs about children that began to shape how they thought when a childcare setting was best. And these things kind of continued on into this next theme of trusting providers, or cara vemos, corazón no sabemos, we see their face, but we don't know their heart. So if the best person I cannot care, I already previewed what I was here on the slide. If I cannot care for my child as my mother, who can take better care of my child than my mom? Because others, cara vemos, corazón no sabemos, we see their face, but we don't know their heart. And why was some of this important is because what we heard a lot from families, and there's a lot of evidence of, is that Latina immigrant families were very interested in the moral preparation of their children because they think that their children are constantly paying attention, and I think generally we all think this. They want to know that the role models in their child's environment are good, upstanding people who will teach their child good morals. Part of this also is connected to ideas of wanting their children to be bien educado or well educated. And educated, bien educado, means in the cognitive and academic sense of wanting to learn to be educated and to do math and to write, but also to know the behavioral and social sense. I know how to interact with others, I'm respectful, I know how to behave well. And so because of that, they're really interested in what the adults around them are, and how do I know this daycare provider can do that for my child? So they're really interested in the character and preparation. We won't go into this, but really kind of concerning stories and myths about maltreatment and danger and babies being given, whiskey or something in their bottle. I mean, this is a larger conversation about stories about danger in immigrant communities that percolate across many communities. And then they really wanted also cariño and responsiveness. They wanted a warmth, nurturing person. Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
All the stuff that we've gone over, even down to the quotes, is my mother.
Yeah.
We are absolutely 0% Latino and
yeah.
So I'm wondering, no disrespect, but do you really need to study for this? Because this is my mother. Excuse me, my mother quit her job when I had a baby because of these things.
Yeah.
Not leaving the baby in a daycare, they won't hug the baby right, they won't do this right, they won't do that right. So my husband and I had to pick up her salary, which was not a lot, which was way cheaper than daycare, I'll throw that out there though. So that my mother would be there with them to do exactly these things, because my mother wanted, they learned to cook with my mother.
Yeah, yeah.
They still do it with my mother and they're 23.
Absolutely.
So I guess I'm not seeing a difference between this being a Latino research thing and we're Italian. So
two things I'm going to go into, because I was anticipating something like this, a study that looks at some of these beliefs with other cultural groups. But before I do that, I think there's two reasons why maybe just focus in this way. One is we're just not seeing the uptake. I mean, this is maybe not big enough, but when you look at some age differences, these are significantly different in some ways, so you're not seeing the uptake, so there's some question about that. And with immigrants, you could see it's lower, so it's why are we seeing this pattern? But also, these are just patterns, right? So it doesn't mean that some of these things aren't also same beliefs and things like that happening with white or black families, or we don't even have AAPI, Asian Pacific Islander families here, right? It's not that some of these things might not be happening there as well. It's just that overwhelmingly we're seeing more of that similar thing within Latine communities. And it is not surprising that you say in an Italian family this prioritization of mom in some way, but also that being around food, around learning from your elders, being socially, that social, emotional, behavioral piece, is when there have been studies about cultural beliefs in education, learning to be, I'm gonna get the word wrong, but this like social, emphasis on social, emotional, or kind of social interaction is high within Italian and Spanish, and kind of Southern European samples. So there is, I think, some overlap, which is also maybe not surprising then when we start thinking about who Latinos are and colonization and a lot of these things carrying over. So I think that's why it's resonating with you. There's actually very similar cultural values in some senses within the communities that your family is from. And I'll talk about that in a minute too. But what I wanted you to think about a little bit is, and this is regardless of families, because we all have culture, you know, parents' ideas about their children's development shapes what they're looking for in their educators and how they think about learning. And they're looking for moral character and what they want their children to be treated with cariño, because they're seeing that they think that their children are constantly learning from what is around them, which is maybe not a specific thing to Latinos, but was coming out as very prominent. Language is important. I know one of the programs we're talking about has a bilingual math, or at least maybe it's throughout the whole school, but language is important, wanting to maintain that. And then cultural values begin driving how they interact with their first educational settings. And I want to do two other things, and we're going to totally, we'll have to think about time in a minute. Their perceptions, this goes back to those resources, their perceptions of what's available to them around them is shaped by what they came from in their home country. So it's very interesting. We had families from a lot of different countries, but in Colombia at the time, Mexico more recently, there is a public preschool program. And so, you know, one of the families saying, in Colombia, the children go through infant gardens since they're 2 years old. It isn't all day, it's a couple hours, and people are used to it. So they take care of their children, or the grandmother does, but they go a couple of hours, so that structure is where they're singing, playing, doing whatever, so it's a habit. And so for these families, they were looking for the thing that they knew was similar to what was in their home country. These families didn't want a full day pre-K program. They thought it wasn't appropriate, but it's modeled because of what their experiences were in their home country. They also were very like, well, there's no public programs in communities where there were public programs. I thought there were only private programs, there weren't public ones. And the same thing that they thought, oh, we wouldn't even have bilingual programs. And this was in one of the communities in New York when actually not only was there a public program, which they didn't think was there, it was a public bilingual preschool program. But they thought because of the political climate that couldn't be possible. So their perceptions of what's available, going back to those community resources conversations, are shaped by their sense of politics, but also what they believe is available and not. So you might have the community closet, right? But if parents don't think that a school would have clothes for them, or a child doesn't think, they're not going to even know to ask for it, going back, I think, to Adam's comment. I don't know if it was Adam's comment. I apologize. All right. It was a good comment. And so that is something that we need to think about, as well as it's based on where they're coming from. So better understanding where families are coming from. So their ideas are shaped by perception of politics and what resources they're aware of. And that shapes their experience with education and government and what they think they can have access to. And I had this will come back later because I was going to go into policy and role of community, but I moved that up earlier.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
In this transition moment, is there a space in this quantitative research to talk about families' class background in their home countries?
We, typically so we did not look at that specifically, but class does play a role in that. Also, where folks are coming from might have changed what their access or programs in their own home country was. But yes.
Educational ideas and cultural
ideas,
right? Coming
yes.
from the country.
Yes, and we see that here in the U.S. too. And I'll talk about that. And the next slide is even ideas about what childhood should look like there's some very famous studies in the US about those who are working class versus upper middle class, how we shape our children's lives look very differently because our beliefs about children. Ideas about, I'm going to structure and put, have soccer and singing and chorus and orchestra, and I need to highly schedule my child. And these are not judgments, these are just patterns, right? And we need to cultivate our children in a very specific way, is an upper middle class cognitive belief that we have here in the US, where there's much more children should kind of let them figure out their own thing, I'm gonna follow their interests, is much more prevalent within working class families in the US as well. So these things aren't just, culture is sometimes place, or place being kind of race and ethnicity or country of origin, but also is income in some ways too. And not to be in a perverse way, not that I want to do too much of like there's a culture of poverty, but there are cultural ways that people engage somewhat. Go for it.
Was there any discussion in the research, or were there any assumptions made as to what environment is actually best for children? I mean, you can see the rate with which you showed the bar graph where Hispanic families were utilizing early childhood education at a less frequent rate. But over time, do they have lesser outcomes because of the decisions that the parent made, or are there actually superior outcomes because kids are more social and emotionally stable? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Other factors.
The preschool research or childhood education research is still slightly mixed on some of these answers. In general, on academic outcomes, we see higher gains in elementary school. It starts to wash out, but then we see the gains kind of pick up in later life outcomes again. So if children are in high quality early childhood settings, we see higher income, greater pursuit of higher education, things like that. The gains, like in middle school and high school, we don't see too much achievement scores difference, but in the elementary we do. This other question about behavioral, there's like a lot of ongoing research, and there's some mix. There is some research that suggests that those who go to center-based preschool might have increased behavioral issues, and there have been some notes of that. But some of this then goes into how are we defining quality and looking at quality in preschool. But yeah, I think these are some of the good questions. But in general, I mean, and you hear this politically right now, it's saturated in our environment, that high quality things like universal pre-K are more supportive over specifically academic outcomes in the long run. And then there's some of the workforce pieces. It supports the family and getting to work and things like that. I have 10 minutes. The reason why, so I'll just go over this quickly. Culture drives how parents are understanding learning. So Latina mothers in other research see themselves as primary teachers of children. Learning is a relational aspect. And I won't go into others, but that these are shaped by their goals for their children. I just spoke to this in income, cultivating children's cognitive abilities with high income, structured explicit learning activities versus this attitude of natural growth, responding to emotional and material needs. And this is there's the book Unequal Childhoods, I believe it's called, by Annette Leroux, is a famous ethnography that records this. And then there's a bigger study going back to this Italy, Spain, Poland, Sweden. I'm not going to go into this for time too much, but they asked families to rate their cultural beliefs. And so this was I was alluding to earlier. And they came up, there was like about 41 items. They kind of they ended up being on these scales of prioritizing cognitive, social competence, good character, difficult temperament, or self-actualization. And what we don't have time to go through is, here is kind of the results by country. And these were mostly middle class families in each country. But in the US, and I think you can see this everywhere, we prioritize the cognitive achievement of our children. That is something that's very cultural in the US. Read to your children. In our pediatrician's office, we have great programs. I'm going to forget the name of the program, but pediatricians across the US, there's a program where they hand children books and families books at every well visit, right? That is what we're prioritizing as a community. Again, I'm not judging these things, I'm just kind of naming the patterns here. So of cognition and self-actualization, in Poland, there was this entrepreneurship and traditionality that they felt was important for the qualities that were that promote success in school. Italy and Spain both had this good character with social and emotional intelligence, more in Italians than Spanish. In the Netherlands, more about their temperament and self-determination, about leadership in a different way from entrepreneurship in Poland, and then Sweden is children as natural beings. And I apologize for time, I'm just like quickly going over these. And they found that I'm missing Australia here. There was Australia as well as a sample. They found that there was higher agreement when cultures were culturally closer. So Italy and Spain were closer in their results, Netherlands and Sweden, US and Australia. There was high consensus within these country groups, so we know this might be something about their culture. And this is very, I think there's a lot of research that in the US we focus on this cognitive competence. So ideas of what success is and what learning is culturally bound. And so maybe for the last little bit, and I can talk about the photo voice and how to make change another time with you all, but it's thinking about, what are the ways that we might think about learning and what we're looking for in schools, and how might that play out in our school. And maybe we'll leave it there. If there's some time, I might give one example of that as well, but maybe that's where we end our conversation. You're acting as cultural broker. So if you begin to understand how the cultural values are different, you can begin to say, let me tell you what the game is here, like what success looks like, what the activities and engagement for success is. Let me help you understand what curiosity versus questioning authority looks like here, and why this curiosity will help you succeed more. And so you play this role as broker, and it goes back to this idea of systems. And I'm thinking an example that I might have made up from the parent coordinator in, I can't even remember, was it PS 16 in Port Richmond? 22. I'm like forgetting the number. I don't know if this story is really true, but I have a story that I've kept with me of a student who, we all have cultural scripts, ideas in education. One of ours is that really easy is A through F is our grading system. A to F is not the grading system around the world. In some places it's numbers 1 through 5 or 1 through 6. Even if it's numbers 1 through 6, sometimes 6 is the equivalent of A, sometimes it's 1. But so a student came from another country and the parent coordinator figured out that they were going home to their family and they were getting Fs on the top of their worksheet, and the student was saying, oh, that is fabuloso. It means it was fabulous. And because the child, yeah, great, so smart, right? Like they're learning, and this is the value. This is the value. Children are often put into these roles. My parent might not know the system. They may not know how to read. I am brokering. They begin to translate, interpret the cultural scripts from both. And beginning to learn what these are so that we can put ourselves in the place to do that for families or for children. So we say, hey, this is what success looks like. If you're coming in, if you're talking to me, I'm able to do this for you. That begins to be the role. And if we can take that away, not that we want to take that away from kids totally, sometimes there's appropriateness to that, but playing that role can be a support too. I really appreciated this time. So I'm bad with time management. There was a whole thing about influencing change and a resource map that I'm happy to talk to at lunch.
We also have another session. So we might
Yeah, that's true. The first two things were the takeaways. Cultural scripts guide parents and children, the ways they approach schools and learning, and their perceptions of communities, the resources they can access, and their trusted networks shape their well-being. I'm really grateful to those immigrant and Latine families who've shared their stories. I collaborate with lots of people. You're only seeing me, but there's teams of students and other collaborators who represent some of these projects. Hopefully I've represented well what families have told me, and I thank you all and the CUNY-IIE team for the invitation. Thank you so much. I'm here for the rest of the afternoon. So.